Grace and peace, everyone. Not long ago, nearly every state in America operated sprawling psychiatric institutions, places that housed thousands of people with mental illness, often for life. By the 1990s, most of those institutions were shuttered. What happened wasn't an accident, but a sweeping policy shift known as deinstitutionalization. It was led by presidents, lawmakers, judges, and mental health advocates. The movement promised freedom, dignity, and community-based care. But while the vision was bold, the reality proved far more complicated. And its legacy still shapes homelessness, incarceration, and healthcare debates today. Now, I've looked into this, into the whole deinstitutionalization movement and so forth, in order to see what happened to all of the state-run psychiatric institutions. So I'm going to allow my assistant, Adeline, to tell you exactly what happened to them.
Most of the large state-run psychiatric institutions in the US, often called asylums or state hospitals, were closed or drastically downsized between the 1950s and the 1990s. A few key reasons explain what happened. 1. Deinstitutionalization movement. In the mid-20th century, psychiatry began shifting away from long-term institutionalization. New psychiatric medications, like Thorazine, introduced in the 1950s, made it possible for many patients to manage symptoms outside of hospitals. Public opinion turned against asylums after reports of overcrowding, abuse, and neglect. Books and exposés, such as The Snake Pit, 1948, and later One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1962-1975 film, shaped perceptions. 2. Federal policy changes. Community Mental Health Act of 1963, signed by JFK, aimed to replace large state hospitals with local community mental health centers. The idea was treatment in less restrictive community-based settings. Medicaid, 1965, created funding incentives for states to move patients out of large institutions because Medicaid would not cover care in institutions for mental diseases but would cover community care. Court rulings, e.g. O'Connor v. Donaldson, 1975, strengthened patients' rights, making it harder to keep people institutionalized against their will unless they posed a clear danger. 3. State budget cuts. By the 1980s, many states saw psychiatric hospitals as expensive and politically unpopular. Funding for community services often didn't match the number of people being released, leaving gaps in care. What replaced them? Some state hospitals still exist today, but with far fewer beds. Care shifted to community mental health centers, though often underfunded, outpatient clinics, short-term psychiatric units in general hospitals. Unfortunately, many people fell through the cracks, leading to today's well-documented issues of homelessness, incarceration, and ER overcrowding among people with serious mental illness. In short, the institutions didn't just disappear, they were intentionally closed or downsized as part of a reform movement that promised community care, but funding and follow-through were often inadequate. Would you like?
Now, you heard it for yourself. We closed those institutions not only because of funding, but because of a movement, a deinstitutionalization movement, as well as various books and movies, such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I remember was almost mandatory in high school to that movie. And what I found when I've looked back into the archives, I find that with each year, beginning in 1953, that they closed these state-run institutions in some areas, there was a correlating increase in the homeless population, and many of which were those former patients. Now, one of the people, the spearheads of the deinstitutionalization movement was Ronald Reagan when he was a governor. He was the governor of California. So I'm going to ask my assistant again. Who are the leaders of the deinstitutionalization movement, and are there still some serving in our government today?
Great question. The deinstitutionalization movement had several kinds of leaders: politicians, mental health professionals, legal advocates, and activists. Here's a breakdown. Key leaders of deinstitutionalization. 1. Political leaders. President John F. Kennedy, a major catalyst. In 1963, he signed the Community Mental Health Act, calling for community-based treatment instead of large state hospitals. His vision was influenced by his sister Rosemary Kennedy's institutionalization. Lyndon B. Johnson expanded funding for Medicaid and Medicare, 1965, which unintentionally encouraged states to move patients out of state hospitals, since federal programs didn't pay for most institutional care. Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, later president. In 1967, he signed the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act in California, which sharply limited involuntary commitment. As president in the 1980s, his administration cut federal mental health funding, pushing even more responsibility to states. 2. Legal and advocacy figures. Civil rights lawyers and judges. O'Connor v. Donaldson, 1975 Supreme Court, ruled that people with mental illness couldn't be confined indefinitely if not dangerous and capable of surviving outside. This case gave legal momentum to deinstitutionalization. Dorothea Dix's legacy, 19th century. While not part of deinstitutionalization, her earlier push to build asylums is often contrasted with the later movement to close them. 3 psychiatrists and mental health professionals. Dr. Franco Basaglia, Italy, global influence. An Italian psychiatrist who spearheaded a similar movement abroad, closing psychiatric hospitals in Italy. His work influenced thinking worldwide. In the US, leaders in psychiatry promoted psychotropic drugs like Thorazine as alternatives to confinement. 4. Grassroots and advocacy groups. National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, founded 1979, and other advocacy groups pushed for rights-based care. Disability rights and patient-led movements, sometimes called psychiatric survivor movements, also fought institutionalization. Are any still serving in government? The direct architects like JFK, Reagan, and the lawyers, judges from the 1960s to 70s are no longer in office. However, their policies still shape mental health law today, especially Medicaid rules from the 1960s that disincentivize institutional care remain in effect. State laws modeled after California's LPS Act, Reagan era, still govern involuntary treatment in many places. Currently, there aren't US politicians who can be called founders of deinstitutionalization still in government, but modern legislators deal with its after effects. Homelessness, incarceration of mentally ill people, ER boarding. If you'd like, I can make you a timeline.
Now, with all that said, you had all of these deinstitutionalization movements, much of it probably based in money and cutting costs. Medicaid not paying to institutionalize people, but trying to force people to let the patients out so that they can have community care. But they never built the institutions or enough institutions or adequately funded them for said community care. So what happens? The people end up on the streets, homeless, talking to themselves, or like a young man in my community. There's a shopping area where I live, and when you go down there, there's a man walking around with this huge cardboard box over his head and a jacket. Although it's been, up in the 90s and 80s, during the summer, but he's still walking around out there. Then with all of the survivor activists, I'm pretty sure some of them are around, although many are aged. Where are all of these activists now? Where is NAMI now? You know what they do to most of the patients, the psychiatric patients, the ones talking to themselves, the ones calling people on the telephone, all of these other people that are doing all these violent things, and some of the people who just have nowhere to go or nowhere to be because they're not aware of who they are or where they are. You know where they put them? In jail. So all of that activism talking about the abuse and cruelty of psychiatric patients back in the day in the psychiatric institutions. How much better are they when you put them in prisons and they become prey to prisoners? Anyone ever think about that? No one has thought about that. We need to reopen the state-run institutions, not only because we have an increasing amount of people suffering from schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has almost tripled, maybe even quadrupled within recent years. A lot of it is rebound psychosis due to marijuana use. People don't want to talk about it, but it is. And then, of course, you have a threefold increase in the amount of children with autism. But at the same time, you have all of these young people who either have what was previously known as Asperger's, or either normal people who just want to be a part of something, acting as if they're autistic, and making it seem as if it's normal, not realizing that a lot of people on the autism spectrum, farther down on the spectrum, have some issues that need care. They have sensory issues. They may have processing issues. They may have sensory pragmatic language and receptive language issues. So what happens in the future when their caregivers die? They end up on the streets. They end up abused. They end up dead. All because our laws have made it easy to close those institutions and de-incentivize people being placed into institutions. Now, I remember a time when if you needed a little help, you could sign yourself in to a psychiatric institution. This is before the final closures in the 90s. You can actually sign yourself in. And if you signed yourself in, you could sign yourself out. What the fight was against was people, sometimes you had husbands, maybe they didn't want the wife that they chose and they wanted someone new, so they would go and put the woman in the psychiatric institution when there was really nothing wrong with her. Now that was abuse. That was the males abusing women, and women because of the status of women in this country. That's what that was about. So yes, I do agree. Maybe you need to deal with that issue. But what they do now, someone like that man that called 911 and said that, metallic things were inside of him, governing his actions and everything, that man should have been taken and committed in an institution. Instead, they let him out. This is dangerous, not only for the patients or people suffering from things in which they have self-regulation difficulties. This is dangerous. This is dangerous for the people who have rebound psychosis or schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, which is also growing, where they hear voices that tell them to kill people or tell them to do things or tell them that someone is against them when nothing of the sort may be happening. In this country, we have a movement where we want to normalize everything and say, oh, they're just a little different. And as soon as you start talking about institutionalization, they want to talk about trans and how the gays were persecuted. This has nothing to do with them. This has everything to do with people who need care. And if we don't start doing something, if we don't reopen those institutions, Kings Park Psychiatric, Pilgrim State, re-expand it. Reopen the ones that were in various parts of New York and so forth. Do we even have one? We have one in Rhode Island, but Open them back up, expand them, and make them state-run, not privately run by Brown University or Lifespan. Something where all they're interested in is making money and using the patients as guinea pigs for the pharmaceutical industry. These places need to be reopened.